Greetings and welcome. My name is Eric Giordano, and I am the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, also known as WIPPS. On behalf of WIPPS, we welcome you to today's webinar, The Voices of Wisconsin Students, Learning, Coping, and Building Resilience During COVID-19. Today, we'll be happy to feature a member of the WIPPS staff and also principal investigator who will present the webinar. But we'll have some brief housekeeping business before that begins. WIPPS was founded in 2007. We're a unit of the University of Wisconsin system with a mission to educate and engage Wisconsin residents, develop future leaders, address community identified needs, and bring the resources of the university to provide research-driven solutions. We'd like to thank you for taking time from your busy schedules today to join us. Now to some housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded and we will make it available on our website and social media, such as our Facebook channel and YouTube channel. Our marketing specialist, Luke Rudolph, will be posting links in the chat section of Zoom. Wisconsin Eye is also recording the session, and you can therefore watch the session on their website after it's done. In addition, a link to a copy of the slides will be emailed to everyone who registered for this presentation, so you'll be receiving that soon. Because we're in a public meeting with over 300 people registered, your microphones and cameras have been turned off. However, you may post your questions or comments at any time using the Q&A function, which is on the lower part of your screen. You can post your questions there and the Q&A feature at any time during this presentation. After the presentation, I will be moderating a question and answer session with our presenter, and I will be using your questions to pose to the presenter. Please note that we'll probably not have time to get to all of the questions, and I apologize in advance for that. But if your question does not get answered today, you're welcome to email it to us at sbelton, B-E-L-T-O-N @uwsa.edu, and we'll be sharing that email with you later in the presentation and in the chat. And we do promise to get back to you and answer your questions in a timely way. Because the Q&A can be read by everyone in this webinar, we kindly ask that you refrain from personal attacks, speech that's intended to demean or cause harm, or other inappropriate comments. Finally, following the Q&A, we have a brief and anonymous survey, basically an evaluation that we really appreciate if you could fill out. It only takes a couple minutes. The link to that will also be posted in the chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharon Belton, Director of WIPPS Research Partners and Principal Investigator for the Voices of Wisconsin Students, Learning, Coping, and Building Resilience During COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Belton.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share with you findings from the Voices of Wisconsin Students project, and am proud to be a member of WIPPS Research Partners and really have an opportunity to put our mission into practice through the partnerships that we've created for this project. This project really reflected a considerable number of partners that helped make it successful. First and foremost, the project itself was supported by the Wisconsin Department of Health Services with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention through an Overdose Data to Action grant. And the project itself was developed with input from many partners, both within the Department of Health Services, but across various aspects of state government and beyond, including the Department of Public Instruction, the Office of Children's Mental Health, UW Extension, and the Medical College of Wisconsin. So while I have the privilege of presenting these findings today, this really reflected a team effort, and I'm proud to be able to represent the project today. So just to give you a quick outline of what I plan to cover today in my remarks, I'll do a brief background description of the project and what the purpose of the project is, give you a little overview of the focus group methods and the approach that we used, and then we'll talk about highlights of key findings, basically spanning 6 themes that emerge from the focus groups, from students' anxiety and depression, to their experiences with their learning environments, to how they're coping and how they're accessing mental health and wellness resources, and then ending with some insights with respect to what the students told us that they need to be successful moving forward. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the next steps are for this project. The project itself, today my comments will focus primarily on findings from the high school focus groups that we conducted, but where relevant, I'll point out some of the key differences that we observed from the middle school groups that we conducted earlier this year. So to give you a little background, how did this project come about? Really, the impetus behind this project got started last summer when a staff person from UW Extension had reached out to the Department of Health Services, trying to find out what information might be available about how students were coping with the pandemic. And last August was, really a time of a lot of unrest in the state of Wisconsin with respect to a lot of the issues that were happening in the communities, and a lot of public policy debates taking place with respect to returning students to school. And there was a lot of interest in knowing, how are students coping? What are some of the issues that they're struggling with? And the Department of Health Services felt that this was an important enough issue to try to get some of the appropriate stakeholders together to talk about what can we do to try to provide more information about the topic of how students are coping. And this coincided with a project that we had done at WIPPS, focused specifically on the voices of Marathon County students, that really served as a foundation for trying to take that model of asking students about what they were experiencing with respect to COVID and expanding it more broadly to a statewide basis. So that's how WIPPS got connected to this project. And we're happy to sort of bring our expertise to trying to understand students' experiences in more detail. So really the focus of this project was to understand how students are coping with school, learning, and life in general within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the intent in gathering this information was to really share students' voices on topics that are of considerable impact to them, and to use this information as another piece of data, and in this case, qualitative data, to help policymakers, stakeholders, community organizations, and school leaders make more informed decisions about issues that are of importance to students and youth, across the state of Wisconsin. We used focus groups specifically for this project, primarily because of the value that focus groups can provide in trying to help understand experiences or how people are coping with certain situations at a more detailed level. Through the focus group methodology, we were really able to access and capture what kids have to say, and therefore what they think about really important issues, and to do it in a systematic and comprehensive way. And as far as I can tell, this is the first study of its kind to use focus group methodologies in this way to gather input of this type from students in middle school and high school. And so we think that this provides a unique contribution of information to policymakers and others in terms of having to make more informed decisions about some of these issues. We conducted the focus groups with students in grades 6 to 12 from diverse backgrounds and from all areas of the state of Wisconsin. We were fortunate to partner with the Medical College of Wisconsin in terms of providing institutional review board approval with respect to the methodologies and the protocols we were using to both enroll student participants in the project and also make sure that we did so in such a manner that we were protecting their privacy and their confidentiality, and also getting their parents' permission for them to participate. We used a very broad statewide recruitment strategy to enroll students in the project because we really wanted to hear from students all across the state, not just in specific or narrowly defined geographic areas. So ultimately, we conducted 23 two-hour Zoom discussions. Each discussion lasted about 2 hours. And we did these over the course of several weeks in January and February of this year. So before we get into the findings, I think it's important to give you a picture of who are the students that we talk to. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to sort of give you a picture of the student participants. I'll show you information for both the middle school and the high school focus groups that we did, recognizing that primarily today I'll be focusing on the results from the high school focus groups that we conducted. So in total, we had over 200 students register for the focus groups, ultimately enrolling into the actual discussions themselves, about 160 total students from both middle school and high school ages across the state. We, specifically focusing on the high school groups, we had 96 high school students representing 29 different counties across Wisconsin and 46 different communities in terms of the hometowns of the students, in terms of where they lived. And those 96 students attended 56 different Wisconsin public, private, and parochial schools. And it was really important to us that we get a very broad cross-section of student voices from across the state. And ultimately, I believe that we were successful in achieving that. To give you a sense of, where were the students from, this slide, and it may be a little bit hard to read the names of the communities, but you can see on the left, the dots represent the different middle schools that were represented in the project through student participants. And then on the right, we have the high schools. And you could see a very broad geographic reach of participants from northern areas of Wisconsin to southern areas, both on the east and west coasts of the state. So we were able to capture a broad geographic scope of student voices. Equally important to capturing a broad geographic scope was that we capture a diversity of experiences with respect to how students were learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. So of the 160 total students that we enrolled in the project in both the middle school and high school levels, about 75% of the students were in some kind of virtual or hybrid learning environment at the time that we conducted the focus groups. Now, an important point to make about this is that when we asked the students, what kind of experience they had with respect to their learning environment, the vast majority of students that we talked to had experienced multiple forms of learning environments during the course of the pandemic. A lot of students may have started out in person and then switched to virtual. A lot were just transitioning to in-person school at the time of the focus groups. And so the kids had the opportunity to experience learning during the pandemic in a lot of different environments and a lot of different situations. And at the time that we did the focus groups, which was January, February, it happened to be a time of transition for some of the students that participated, in that they were anticipating going back to school at the start of the second semester of the school year, or many, in fact, had just started back learning in person. So it gave a really rich perspective of experiences in that students had experienced learning in a lot of different environments. We also had diversity of demographic characteristics of the focus group participants. And here you can see the distributions of students with respect to gender, race, and whether or not they were receiving free and reduced lunch at the time of the focus groups. We really wanted to make sure we captured different kinds of experiences based on different backgrounds and characteristics of the students. So ultimately, at the conclusion of the focus groups, we had 23 different sources of information that we needed to pull together in order to identify common themes that ran across all of the focus groups. And ultimately, we produced 4 separate reports that are available on our website. You can see the location on the screen. We separated the findings for both middle school and high school. And within each of those categories, not only did we produce a summary report, but we also felt that it was very important to capture in their own words a lot of what the students had to say about how they were coping, what new skills they had developed with respect to their resiliency, and also what did they say they need to be successful. And if I could leave you with anything today in terms of, what can you do with the information that I'm sharing, I really urge you to even spend 10 minutes accessing the reports, because in a presentation like this, or in a report, or in a few bullet points, it's really difficult to capture the emotional power of the students' words. And the best way to understand how the students were experiencing their learning or coping with COVID is to read what they had to say. And we really tried to represent the students' voices as best we could in the reports. So it was very clear, now shifting to what did the students have to say. Overarching, all of the focus groups that we conducted was a real desire on the part of students to want their voices to be heard. They want people in decision-making roles to ask them how they're feeling, what their thoughts are on ways that they can improve their situations. They value communication back and forth, and they really want the perspectives of students to be taken into consideration and feel like their opinions matter. And so when I walk through the findings today, I'm going to do my best to convey the richness of feedback that the students offered us in terms of the topics that we covered. So what I'm going to do now is give you an overview of sort of the high level key themes that emerged from the focus groups. And then we'll go through each of these in detail and talk a little bit about what the findings are in each of these areas. So first and foremost, probably one of the most compelling themes that ran across the focus groups was that the students that we talked to were and are experiencing high and increasing levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. And for many of you professionals that are listening to this today, that's probably not a surprise given your professional backgrounds. But what we think this study can add value to is to understanding what are the sources of students' stress, anxiety, and depression, what's causing it, and what do they need to be successful in managing some of the feelings that they're having. It was very clear in talking with the students that they had significant challenges and were experiencing significant challenges with their virtual learning environments. And when I use the term virtual learning environment in the context of this presentation, I'm referring to any kind of situation where a student was not learning in person at school. So that could be a virtual academy, a virtual school, learning from home, remote learning, e-learning, blended learning, meaning the at-home days. For a lot of the students, they might be attending school in person, but might had to have been quarantined or isolated for a certain period of time from school. So when you hear me say virtual learning, I'm referring to environments that really encompass all of those situations when kids aren't learning in person. And for the majority of many of the students that we talked to, they were experiencing significant challenges with their learning environments that were contributing to some of the stress, anxiety, and depression that they were experiencing. Another pervasive theme that ran across the focus groups was a sense of feeling a lack of connectedness to their school, to their teachers, and their friends. And this was not unique just to students that were in virtual learning environments. Even students that were attending school in person expressed feelings of lack of connectedness, particularly to their friends, many of whom who had friends that either attended school on a different day than they did, or who might have had friends that had to continue learning from home for some reason. So this overall lack of connectedness was really a theme that cut across a lot of the conversations that we had with the students. Perhaps not surprisingly, during the environment of COVID, we already know that students have high expectations of their teachers, but those expectations were even more heightened during the COVID-19 environment. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means from the perspective of the students in a moment. When we asked students about where they were getting help and what kinds of mental health resources they were accessing for some of the things that they were experiencing, both at the middle school and the high school levels, the students had generally limited awareness of mental health resources or places to go or where to go when they needed help. And that was true at both the middle school and the high school levels. When we talked with them about what were some of the barriers that they experienced with respect to getting help, a lot of them expressed issues that would fall under the realm of stigma, having skepticism about whether getting help would actually help address some of the concerns that they were experiencing. And many of them were very concerned about confidentiality and privacy with respect to the potential implications of seeking help. So against that backdrop, we also wanted to talk to students about what coping skills they had developed or were developing with respect to how to address COVID and the pandemic. And one of the things that emerged from the focus groups was that many of the students had perceived increases in substance use, particularly alcohol and drugs at the high school level, and more so vaping at the middle school level amongst their peers. So I guess we could describe that as more of a negative coping strategy with respect to the consequences of COVID on students for the last year or so. At the same time, and I know a lot of what I just talked about might seem very negative, I think it's also very important to point out that it was very clear from the conversations with students that despite all of the challenges that they've experienced over the past year, that they've developed many new coping skills and ways to feel resilient in the context of their learning and their lives during COVID. So that's just a very high level overview of what we heard from the students, and I'm going to walk through these in a little more detail as we go forward. So the first thing that I want to focus on are the students' comments with respect to stress, anxiety, and depression. And really, if you read through the reports and you see the quotes that we've included from the students, you see a common theme of terminology such as I'm anxious, I'm struggling, I feel depressed. For many of the students who might have had underlying issues before, COVID increased their feelings of anxiety and depression to a whole other level. And they were not only conscious of this from their own perspective, they could also see that their friends and their peers were struggling with many of these issues as well. And that, as one student put it, people are having a tough time. And I think that really sums up a lot of what we heard from the students. So with this theme of high stress and anxiety during COVID, and for many of the students, their stress and anxiety getting worse, we really wanted to understand, what were the factors that were contributing to their thoughts and feelings regarding stress and anxiety. And we talked a little bit about the challenges of virtual learning. For many of them, they were experiencing, real issues keeping up with their homework, particularly in a virtual learning environment. And trying to keep up with their homework in an environment where they were struggling with accessing help and connecting with their teachers, for many of the students, caused them to fall behind in terms of getting their work done. And I can tell you, personally, having observed the vast majority of the focus groups that we did, students care deeply about their school and their learning and their grades. And the fact that many of them were struggling with school and their grades was deeply concerning to them and contributing to a lot of the anxiety that they were feeling. Many of them expressed concerns about changes in their study skills or study habits that they had experienced during the pandemic, in that, some students acknowledged that because of the challenges that they were experiencing with virtual learning, they might resort to taking shortcuts in getting their assignments done, or, just feeling like they couldn't get the work done and putting it aside and falling behind. And so for many of the students, this almost was like a perfect storm of factors that have come together to really make them concerned about their futures, not just the immediate, I need to get my homework done, but am I going to be able to do with my life the things that I want to do? For many of them, it might be go to college. For others, it might be get practical experience that they need in order to be able to enter the workforce. Concerns about their futures was deeply concerning to many of the students that we talked to. And obviously, for many students, school provided social outlets that for many of them, they were deeply affected by the diminished social opportunities that they had in terms of being able to connect with their friends. And all of this is taking place in an environment where many of the students perceived that they had limited access to support. And so all of this contributes together for what was the case for many students and is a period of high stress and anxiety. We also learned, from my perspective, a number of things about students' levels of stress, anxiety, and depression that I thought were interesting in terms of the things that came out of the focus groups. There were a number of students that we talked with that reported less stress and anxiety during COVID due to the fact that during their learning from home period, whether that's 100% virtual or some kind of hybrid model, they were able to get more sleep. It was very clear that middle school and high school students really valued sleep. And for many of them, they were able to get that additional sleep that they needed during the last year of COVID. That's not to say that that's true of all of the students that we talked with, but for many of them. Many of them liked the decreased social pressure and more downtime that was associated with their learning from home experience. And at the same time, several of the students that we talked to told us that they were experiencing less stress and anxiety. For some of the students, it also reflected a sense of apathy or numbness. In other words, one young woman that we talked to expressed that she had been so used to being disappointed over the past year and things being canceled and looking forward to things that ultimately didn't happen, that she just kind of felt numb after so many months of experiencing COVID. And I think some of the comments that students were offering us regarding this sense of numbness was consistent with some of what we heard about decreases in motivation towards school that many students have experienced over the last 6 to 7 months. In some cases, individual family approaches to how an individual family is handling COVID and COVID safety can create some additional social pressures for kids. Some students may have families that are very concerned about COVID safety and might not allow their student to go out or to spend a lot of time with friends. And for a lot of those students, it created this fear of missing out on experiences that they might see other friends participating in, which would cause them to sort of pull back from their friend group and isolate themselves because they didn't want to perpetuate that feeling that they were missing out on something. And at the other end of the spectrum, kids who had family situations that did allow them more flexibility in terms of what they could do, in terms of staying connected with their friends, felt bad that their friend that was at home wasn't with them. So being sensitive to those family approaches or how an individual family is approaching COVID safety and how that's impacting, the mindset of their teens, is an important consideration that came out of the focus groups. Several of the students expressed anxiety about returning to in-person school. And while they were all very eager, most of them, I should say, were very eager about returning to school in person, that didn't mean that they didn't have some anxiety about it. In particular, wanting reassurance that if and when they did return to school in person, that their school was going to be taking steps to keep them safe and would be enforcing whatever the school's safety protocols are with respect to COVID consistently and having those enforcement mechanisms in place. A lot of the students expressed concerns that during COVID and the the isolation period that many students had experienced, that they had lost some of their people skills. One student expressed that she had returned to school for a specific purpose earlier in the year, and she felt her chest tighten when she entered the school building because it had been so long that since she had been there, she wasn't sure how she should feel and how she should interact, with other students. So regaining those people skills and those study skills could be important for helping students address some of the stress and anxiety that they might be feeling with respect to returning to school in person. And talking about returning to school in person was especially hard for kids who we talked to who needed to stay virtual because of maybe health issues going on in their family, that they themselves might really want to be returning to school in person, but they felt that obligation to a family member of remaining virtual in order to keep that family member safe. So those students who may need to remain virtual for various personal or family reasons might need some additional support in terms of helping them cope with that need to stay at home while their friends may be returning to school on an in-person basis. So in terms of what did students tell us about their learning environments, it's probably not a surprise that a lot of the focus group discussions were dominated by discussions about virtual learning or hybrid learning models because of the fact that 75% of the students, and this is across the state, were experiencing some kind of virtual learning at the time that the focus groups were conducted. And a lot of the comments that they provided to us spoke about the challenges that they were experiencing in trying to be successful in getting their work done. So we'll talk a little bit about what those challenges are in terms of what the students' comments were. Probably one of the most pervasive comments that we heard from the students across both the middle school and the high school levels was that they were experiencing significant increases in their workload during the pandemic. And more than a few students expressed that they felt that their teachers were maybe trying to make up for the lack of in-person instruction and in-person learning by giving students more work to do. And the students felt like that from their perspective, that the teachers were giving them more work because if they were doing more work, then they might be more engaged. And for some students, that kind of approach might have backfired in that some of them had trouble engaging with their learning. And many of them expressed, maybe being a hands-on learner and missing out on those opportunities to learn the material that they were expected to learn in a format that was difficult for them to engage with. Probably the most frustrating thing for the students that we talked to with respect to trying to be successful with their learning was difficulties in accessing teachers for help. Many of the students expressed that they would try to complete an assignment and would hit a roadblock, and the steps that they would need to take in order to be able to access their teacher for help either took a considerable amount of time or for many of them, the teacher might be, they might be at home and the teacher might be at school teaching in-person students. And so that when the teacher could provide help, there was a disconnect between when the teacher was available and when the student might need it. And many of the students acknowledged the difficult position that their teachers were in terms of students needing help in the evenings when teachers shouldn't necessarily be expected to provide that help in the evenings, or making sure there was a reasonable expectation of when their teachers could be there for them. And this wasn't a situation necessarily where the students were blaming the teachers. It was just a function of the situation that they were in. And that was probably the most frustrating thing for the students, was trying to get their work done and being able to get help when they needed to do it. And that also played out particularly for students that were learning in a hybrid model. Many of the students that we talked to about their learning environments expressed a sense of feeling forgotten when other students had returned to school in person. So this would have been a situation where maybe an entire school had returned to school in person and someone needed to remain at home. Those virtual learners that were at home, many of them expressed comments that reflected a sense that they felt forgotten. One student used the term that they felt invisible to their teachers and to their peers because they were a virtual learner. And this was particularly a struggle for kids that were trying to learn in synchronous blended models, that where a teacher might be trying to teach students both in person and at home at the same time. The students that were at home trying to learn felt maybe a little bit cut off or separated from the students that were actually physically learning in person. And for many of the students, this has resulted in significant decreases in their motivation for learning over the past school year so far. And as I mentioned earlier, for many of the students, that's deeply troubling. And obviously, with technology, a lot of the students express that the cameras and the use of cameras or the lack of use of cameras was creating a barrier for them in terms of feeling connected to their teachers and just generally experiencing technology issues. And we'll talk about some of the mental health concerns in a moment. And at the same time, students across all of the focus groups could identify some positive aspects of virtual learning, things that despite challenges that they might have been experiencing. And I think it's also important to say that there were students that we talked to that actually felt more successful in a virtual learning environment than they did in either a hybrid or in-person environment, or in what they would describe as a more normal school environment. And in terms of the positive aspects of virtual learning, many of the students liked the increased flexibility that the virtual learning environment provided them. They could work at their own pace, they could take breaks. They liked having the extra time to pursue other hobbies and activities. The whole process of virtual learning helped many of the students understand their own learning styles. I mentioned earlier, many of them used it as an opportunity to get much of the sleep that they needed. And across the board, students really liked having the flex day that many of the schools have implemented over the last year, like, for example, a Friday, what the students would describe as an off day, where they could maybe go in school and get help if they needed it, and having that flexibility that would allow them to either be learning some of the time in person, but also have that flex day to catch up on a lot of things that they needed. So shifting to the issue of connectedness and belonging, we know from the literature that students feeling connected to their schools and their teachers and having a sense of belonging can lead to improved academic outcomes and achievement. And it was very clear that many of the students that we talked to in the focus groups were feeling that loss of connection, not only to their peers, but to their teachers. And those that might be in person were experiencing a greater sense of connection to their teachers and their peers than those that were learning virtually. So what did this mean from the students' perspective? As I mentioned, the lack of connectedness to school, teachers, and friends was much more pronounced for virtual learners. I can't stress enough how deeply the students miss opportunities to socialize, participate in their sports, their clubs, their extracurricular activities, those kinds of structured activities that schools provide really are central to many students feeling like they're connected to their school and also connected to their friends and to their teachers. And they really miss those opportunities. Freshman students that participated in the focus groups, and this was also true of new middle school students, many of them felt especially disconnected from their schools because many of them had never physically set foot in their schools at the time that the focus groups were conducted. So they didn't know the teachers, they didn't know a lot of their fellow students, and it was hard to get to know their fellow students because of the virtual format of their classes. And this was true both at the high school and the middle school levels. One interesting thing that came out of the discussions with the students about connectedness and belonging was that understanding that they were all experiencing the pandemic from a common perspective helped some students feel less alone. And there were several students that mentioned teachers who had helped their class or a group of students understand the common experience of the pandemic was really helpful to them in putting some of the things that they were feeling into a broader perspective of, we're all in this together, and that helped them feel less alone. So speaking specifically about the role of teachers, as I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, we know that teachers play an especially important role in helping students feel connected. And this importance of student-teacher dynamics was is even more heightened in the context of the pandemic. And a lot of the comments that the students made with respect to their connectedness with their teachers, it was clear that they were missing out on those spontaneous interactions that they have with teachers that they would be experiencing in a normal school environment. Many of them, for example, expressed that, well, I might talk to my teacher before school or be able to go and ask them a question during lunch or after school. Missing out on those spontaneous interactions with teachers, was really impactful for the students. And many of them noted that they had teachers that were doing really small, what might seem insignificant things that really resonated with them in terms of helping them cope with COVID and helping them cope and feel more connected. A teacher simply taking 5 minutes at the beginning or at the end of the class to have an open discussion with the students about how are you doing, how are you feeling, really resonated with the students to reflect that their teacher really cared about them. Asking students to turn their cameras on, or asking a student who might not have had their camera on for a few classes, reaching out to them to make sure that they were okay, were small things that teachers could do that really had an impact on how students felt about their ability to stay connected with their teachers. We talked about a minute ago, the students' comments with respect to the inability to get help when they needed. They really wanted to be able to access their teachers so that they could feel successful in completing their work. And we talked a little bit about how turning cameras on and off can really have a big impact on a student's ability to feel connected with their peers. And the middle school students in particular noted that some of their teachers had disabled the chat functions on their virtual learning platforms, and they really were frustrated by that because they like to be able to, at the beginning of a class, spend a few minutes chatting with their friends and in their class. And they expressed frustration that they weren't able to do that in a lot of their classes. And there were several students that mentioned that a student routinely turning their cameras off during their online learning was really a signal that they may be struggling with something, and were kind of looking for their teachers to reach out to them to figure out, why were they turning their cameras off, and was there something that they needed? So in terms of where are students going to get help with a lot of the things that we're talking about, this is an area where I think, we spent a lot of time talking with the students, and it was very clear at the high school level, friends are the primary source of student support, and then parents. At the middle school level, it was really the parents, and especially mom, that the students referenced as being their primary source of support. However, in talking with the students, it became really unclear whether peers or friends and parents have the tools that they need to be able to help kids with some of the complex issues that they're experiencing. And a lot of the students, while they mentioned that they rely on their friends and that they turn to their friends, they also recognize that they don't want to be a burden to their friends with a lot of the emotions that they're feeling. And I think it's, very challenging for kids in the context of the COVID environment, where they recognize that their friends are their primary source of support, but a lot of those normal mechanisms and avenues that they would be using to access those friends have been cut off. So perhaps it's not a surprise that students are experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety because they don't have that frontline access to their main support mechanisms through their friends. When we ask kids about their awareness of ways to get help in the context of their school, there was consistently very limited awareness on the part of students in terms of school-based resources for mental health and wellness support. And this was true almost in every focus group that we did, is that the students that we talked to really struggled to identify school-based sources of support for mental health and wellness issues that they may be struggling with. And when we did press the students a little bit further in the context of the discussions, many of them referenced their school counselors. And many of them gave very specific examples of ways in which their school counselors were trying to help them, trying to connect with them, and trying to provide resources. But from the students' perspective, many of them noted that their counselors were often too busy, or at least they perceived them to be too busy, and therefore they didn't want to take advantage of their counselors as a potential source of help during the pandemic. And many of the students expressed a desire for or a need for more resources at school to help them with mental health and wellness. And the reality is that a lot of the students that we talk to describe that they end up dealing with feelings on their own. And as one student put it, that they just suffer in silence because they don't either know where to get help, or they might know where to get help, but they don't want to burden the individual that they might want to seek out. And that gets to, some of the barriers that we learn from students about accessing support. Stigma was probably the biggest one that we heard from the high school students. Embarrassment, a sense that they should be able to handle things on their own, and a fear of being judged, or fear of not having their privacy maintained when they did seek out help. So stigma, that was the main reason that we heard from students in terms of why they don't seek help when they need it, particularly in the school context. And a lot of the students use terminology such as fear, embarrassment, shame, judgment, that they don't want to be seen as, quote, crazy, as some of the students put it. And that was probably the main reason that the students talked about with respect to not seeking help when they needed it. Another theme that we heard in terms of barriers to accessing help was some of the students expressed skepticism about if they did reach out for help, whether it would actually work. And for some of them, they struggled with how to talk about or describe some of the things that they were feeling. And for some of the students, it was a sense that not knowing if what they were feeling was normal, or if it really was suggestive of something that might need more support or help. In almost all of the focus groups that we conducted, students gave examples of where they had reached out for help, but where they felt that there was some kind of breach of trust, or that they were concerned about being able to share their thoughts in a confidential way. And that just sort of set the tone for them that if they were struggling, they wouldn't be able to seek out help because they didn't think that they would be able to have that confidentiality, or that they couldn't have the confidence or the trust of the person that they were reaching out to. And we talked about school counselors and a perception that they were too busy. In terms of coping mechanisms, so shifting gears here, we talked about both negative coping mechanisms, and then we'll end with a more positive view of positive coping mechanisms. There was really a mixed perception of how the pandemic has impacted students' drug and alcohol use. There were most of the students, or many of the students, had perceived that there have been increases in the use of drugs, particularly marijuana, alcohol, and vaping products amongst students and their peers during the pandemic. And it's important to note that this was not self-reported information about the students that we talked to, but we talked to them about their perceptions of their peers and in their social environment around them in terms of how COVID had impacted, drug and alcohol use amongst their peers. And many of them attributed to the increases in drug and alcohol use with a lack of other healthy coping mechanisms, and also the boredom, increased free time, and lack of supervision, that many of them were experiencing during, the large amount of time that they were experiencing at home. And for many of the students, they speculated that the use of drugs and alcohol were alleviating feelings of fear and isolation amongst a lot of the students that were struggling with mental health issues during this time. And that's not to say that there were not some students that felt that the pandemic had actually decreased substance use amongst their peers due to less ability to access drugs and alcohol particularly they were referencing during, the lockdown period when a lot of kids couldn't leave the house or couldn't access, normal ways they might access drugs or alcohol. And I should also point out in the middle school focus groups, there was a lot of discussion about increasing the use of vaping products at the middle school age, less discussion about the use of drugs or alcohol amongst the middle school students. So we've talked a lot about negatives. Let's talk about some of the positives, because it really is important to present a balanced view of how students have experienced COVID. I think it's very important to note that while the students are struggling or may have expressed comments related to struggling, many of them, most of them, are finding reasons to be positive and are developing new coping skills. And I think there's a lot of hope in hearing what the students have to say in terms of how they've handled the pandemic. Many of them have developed a greater sense of gratitude for their family and their friends, a very deep appreciation for school, especially being at school in person, that they might not have had before the pandemic. Having that sense that if something is taken away, you really appreciate it when it's returned back to you. Almost all of the students could identify some kind of new skill that they had developed from their time in virtual learning, whether it was having better time management skills, being more of a self-advocate in terms of trying to get things done, understanding their learning preferences. And for many, they have been able to use this past year to explore some new interests and hobbies, whether it's music, art, dance, playing chess, spending time online with their friends. Almost every student that we talked to had some kind of new coping skill or way that they had developed to feel more resilient during the pandemic. I thought it was interesting. A lot of the high school students talked about they just like to get in their car and take a drive and spend time alone and listen to music. And that was one of the ways that they had coped during the last year. Now, ending on some commentary related to what do students say they need to be successful. This is where I really hope that all of you who are listening today will take some time to go to the reports and read both the middle school and high school reports that are titled In Their Own Words. Because in those reports, we compiled verbatim the responses from the 160 students that we talked to in order to convey as clearly as we could what students said they need from their schools and from school leaders to be successful, not just now, but into the future. And it's really, this slide doesn't really do justice to all of what the kids had to say, but I tried to categorize a lot of the things that they had to say into some common themes. The most prevalent point that the students made in terms of what they need to be successful has to do with more understanding, empathy, and sympathy from their school leaders in terms of trying to put yourselves in the shoes of students in terms of what they're trying to go through, and having the student's perspective in mind when making decisions about the things that are going to be impacting them. So I really hope you'll take some time to read the In Their Own Words reports. So in terms of summarizing the key themes that we learned from the focus groups: high stress, anxiety, and depression, challenges with their learning environments, not just virtual, but learning environments in general. And this is likely to persist into the future as kids, return to in-person learning, either they already have this year or going into the fall. Regaining those connections with their school, with their teacher and their friends, maintaining those relationships with their teachers, helping them access mental health resources, and overcoming a lot of the barriers that they described in terms of trying to get help when they need it. And then reinforcing those positive coping mechanisms that they have developed and ways to be more resilient that they think that will benefit them in the years to come as they transition and as we all transition through the COVID pandemic. In terms of what's next for this project, I've talked about, accessing the reports. That's really the most compelling way for you to really get the emotional impact of what the students had to say. And I can assure you that reading what the students had to say, can have an emotional impact in terms of really seeing how articulate they are in terms of the comments that they provided. We've provided and done this, the project, and now we have the reports. What we really hope will happen is that we shift now from this information gathering stage to action. And that's where the responsibility for taking this project to the next step lies with all of you that hopefully are listening today, is that taking the findings and taking what the students had to say and looking at the implications in terms of what new ideas will this generate to support students? What new ways will there be to include student voices in the future? What can we do to continue to support students, not only in the coming months, but in the years ahead as we all get beyond COVID? I've provided, again, the website for the reports. And again, this will be in the chat. My colleague Luke will be providing it. I want to shift to allowing at least a few minutes for questions. And again, if there is a question that you have that I'm not able to answer now, I will respond via email and get back to you. I want to thank you all for listening today and hearing not only what I have to say, but what the students have to say. So I'll stop, and I think we probably have at least 3 or 4 minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Sharon. Really appreciate all the hard work you and your colleagues put into this project. And we do have a couple of questions, and we'd like to encourage our viewers and listeners to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A section. And as I said, if we don't have time to get to all of them, Sharon will respond directly if you email her, and that email is both in the on the slides, and also Luke will be posting that in the chat section. So the first question is, I find kind of interesting, and a question that I kind of I've had myself. Do you think the area where the students lived in the state, whether it's northern, southern, central, eastern, western, et cetera, played any part in how the students dealt with COVID?
I'm really glad that question was asked, because it's a point that I had intended to make. We had thought at the beginning of this process that there would be large geographic differences in what we heard from the students, and which was one of the reasons why we wanted to have such broad geographic representation. And we had conducted focus groups based on rural, urban, and suburban communities. And what we found was that regardless of the kind of community or where the student was living in the state, the same common themes emerged. So some of those, obviously there were some small geographic differences, but I think the key point that I want to convey here is that the themes that came out of these focus groups were persistent regardless of where the students were from and where they were geographically in the state. So thank you for that question.
Okay, another viewer has a kind of a two-part, so I'll go with the first one. And I'm not sure that this came out at all in the report, so I'm kind of curious what you think about this. This person's wondering how transgender and non-binary students feel about learning from home. And for example, they mentioned the ability to use bathrooms without harassment.
That topic specifically did not come up during any of the discussions. I will say, however, that there were several students who, in the context of talking about positive aspects of the pandemic, had noted that they had used the pandemic as an opportunity for a lot of self-reflection about their gender identity and their sexuality. And as a result of the pandemic process, had been able to learn more about themselves and feel more comfortable with who they were and who they wanted to express themselves to in terms of their friends. And I thought that was a really positive outcome, if you will, of the period that students had at home.
Sharon, kind of follow on to that. Someone's wondering if learning from home helped with bullying, or whether online bullying maybe became more of an issue because students, were a lot of more online or hybrid. So did any of those ideas come up in the focus groups?
There were specific examples of where those ideas came up from both perspectives. There were several students, and I should say this wasn't a pervasive theme of the focus groups. There were several students who felt that by being at home, they were removed from bullying that they may have been experiencing when they were on site at school. So there was that perspective that there might be less bullying going on. And in the particular case of one student, they felt that they were able to remove themselves from some specific instances of racism that they had been experiencing in the context of their in-person school environment. And there were several students that mentioned that while they were at home during virtual learning, there was a lot more use of social media, and that there may have been more incidents taking place via social media in terms of cyber bullying. So it was a very mixed experience with respect to how the learning from home environment was impacting those issues. It was not a pervasive theme, though, that emerged from the discussions with the students.
Okay, thank you. Abby is asking, when expressing interest about more mental health resources, were there any examples of resources that students were looking for or hoping to be connected to?
In the reports themselves, we do provide a list of things that the students mentioned in the context of talking about that. Several of the students mentioned that if they had access to mental health therapists at school, that they would access them. Or I probably should say that differently. If mental health therapists were available at school, they would be interested in accessing them. Some students mentioned the benefits of peer-to-peer type discussions and being able to talk with their friends about issues that were bothering them. Not every student viewed peer-to-peer kinds of mental health support as positive, but there were several students that expressed that they wished that they had opportunities to talk with their friends about some of these things in the context of the school environment.
Okay, thank you. Kristen is wondering, when you are referring to school counselors, are you speaking about school counselors specifically, or using that term to speak about general student services and support staff?
The students themselves were referring more specifically to their guidance counselors. A lot of them use the terminology guidance counselor as being too busy. they were not using that term more broadly to refer to, for example, maybe the school psychologist or a social worker. They were more likely to be referring to what from their perspective would be the guidance counselor as being too busy.
Hopefully a quick question. Does the high school, middle school reports include all quotes just in different sections, or are there additional quotes in their own words report?
There are additional quotes in their own words report that are very specific to two questions that we talked about, which were what coping mechanisms had been developed and what did the students say they needed to be successful. We felt that those two aspects of the focus groups were compelling enough that they warranted their own basically compilation. In the larger reports themselves, we included, for all of the things that I just talked about, examples of quotes that support the findings, that I talked about today. So both sets of reports will provide a very good perspective of what the students had to say across all of these topics.
Okay, thanks. John is wondering about to what extent issues of students talked about their parents, and in particular, did students' viewpoints reflect the satisfaction, dissatisfaction of their parents with the mode of instruction that was being offered by their district? So for example, schools were virtual and this prevented parents rather from returning to work. Did that add stress to the level of students? So was there impact from the parents' perspective and how that impacted the youth?
I'm going to be honest, that did not come across in the focus groups. For the most part, when students talked about their parents, the comments came up in two ways. One, many of them viewed their parents as a key source of support for them, such that if they did have a problem, they would, turn to their parents. For high school students, their first place they would go would be their friends. Middle school students would go to their parents. But parents clearly have an important role in supporting their students' mental health. The second way in which the students talked about their parents had to do with what their parents would allow them to do with their friends from a social perspective, and how, depending on what their parents or family philosophy was about COVID and social connections and safety, how that might impact how they were able to connect with their friends. There were several students that mentioned that they had responsibilities for taking care of their siblings while they were trying to go to school, and that was really challenging for them. But that was, the primary, that was not a pervasive theme of the students. However, it did come up that the parents needing to work made it more challenging for those students that did have responsibilities for taking care of their siblings.
Okay, another person is asking, did the conflicting information through the news media by politicians, political parties, social media, et cetera, affect the mental state of students? Did this come out in any of the focus groups?
That's a really interesting question. And what I can say about that is that the students were able to discuss all of these topics from a surprisingly apolitical perspective, that regardless of what was going on in the media, or regardless of what an individual's own personal philosophy was about, for example, masks or in-person learning, the students had very sophisticated, nuanced, insightful, and respectful perspectives on these topics, such that the discussions were not political in any way. And there was honestly, no real mention of the political context in which policy debates were occurring in the pandemic that seeped through into the students' discussions about these topics. So while many discussions amongst adults can sometimes become political with respect to COVID. The kids themselves really approached all of these discussions from a very empathetic perspective, in that not only would they share their own view, they were genuinely interested in what their fellow students had to say about these topics. And many of them expressed that they were deeply affected by hearing what each other had to say about these topics. And that kind of feedback is also included in the reports.
Thanks. Just want to remind people that if you have to drop off, if you'd be willing to fill out a quick 2-minute anonymous survey about the presentation, the link is in the chat and we'd sure appreciate it. But we'll go ahead and take a few more questions here. Let's see. Brenna asks, is there a breakdown for demographics of the students that were in the focus groups?
Yes. Yep. If you go to the reports themselves, in the appendices, yes, we provide the demographic characteristics of the students in terms of gender, race and ethnicity, what grade the students were in, and whether or not the student was receiving free or reduced lunch. So you can see for each of the reports that demographic breakdown.
Sharon, do you see schools making more time for reflection and self-care as students have become more used to taking care of themselves at home throughout the day? Things like time to go outside, taking longer breaks, and open campus. I was remembering a couple students talking about, being able to play with their pets in between, taking a break, but things like that, self-care issues.
I think what actions are taken as a result of this kind of information really are in the hands of schools and school leaders. I mean, our role at WIPPS is to provide this foundation of information, and it will be up to school leaders, community organizations, those working directly with youth, we hope will find nuggets or insights from these reports that they can use to make decisions about what they want to do in the context of their school settings. And hopefully there are implications from these findings that they can use to make some tangible decisions on their own.
Yeah, it's just a quick shout out to Savitri. I am not asking your question because it's kind of similar, and I think the response would be very similar, although your question's great. So if you want to communicate with Sharon on the side, please just go ahead and email her. One person, Evelyn, asks if there's going to be any sort of similar study, or is there any implication for elementary students?
That wasn't part of the this particular project, but I think that it would be equally important to get the insights from elementary age students as well, in terms of how they're experiencing the pandemic. And I think they might provide a different experience, because I think, and I don't have the statistics to cite here, but I think in some parts of the state, elementary students were more likely to be in person than perhaps high school students during COVID, and elementary students might provide a different viewpoint of how they experienced the pandemic. So, and I think equally important is trying to understand the experiences of teachers, of school counselors, of parents, as equal stakeholders in this whole process of the pandemic. So that's an excellent question.
So I think that's all the questions we have, Sharon. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to you for any concluding thoughts you have.
Sure. I thank you everyone for your time. Thank you to those that stayed on a little bit later. There's obviously an enormous amount of information to cover in a short amount of time, and I appreciate your attention. As Eric mentioned, please don't hesitate to email me at my email address that you see on the screen, or is probably in the chat, if you have any other questions, or if you have feedback you want to share, or particularly suggestions of how we can get the word out in terms of the findings of this project, so that the people have the opportunity to benefit from the information. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, and if you're willing to take that quick anonymous survey as you exit, we'd sure appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.